a seismologist from Lamont. Einat, you want to tell us a little bit more about yourself? Chris, let's
Yes,
start
of course.
recording.
Thanks for coming and having me again. I remember fondly how much fun it was. I think, I don't know, a few years ago when I gave a session. And yeah, it's funny. There's one thing that I'm not is a seismologist. And then I'm a volcanologist. I study volcanoes, volcanic eruptions. I'm mostly I think of myself as a kind of fluid mechanics person, a physics person looking at the physics of eruptions, mostly volcanoes, but today you'll hear about geysers, which are similar and different in some ways. I've been at Lamont since 2009. I got here as a postdoc and stayed as a Lamont research professor. Um, a little bit back, I did my PhD in geophysics at MIT and my undergrad in geophysics and computer science in University of Tel Aviv. And yeah, that's about it. I can start my presentation. Let me share my screen. See if that works. Zoom. Can you all see my screen or my slide?
Yes.
Okay, in the appropriate, not speaker mode or anything. Excellent. Okay, so um, we've heard a few people who went to Iceland and saw geysers in the field, and sure, there's a good way to study geysers is to go to the field and see them, but it also requires travel and requires permits, and that's all very complicated. So I want to tell you today about how we are spending time in the fluid mechanics lab at Lamont studying geyser dynamics. Um, this is a collaborative effort that I've been doing for the last 2 years or so with a team from UC Davis, Professor Max Rudolph, and an undergrad student, Utkarsh Das, and Rob Son from Woods Hole, who's really an expert on geysers and hydrothermal systems, and a marine seismologist. So together, we also have in our team Akshat Yakpala, who is an undergrad at Columbia, who started as a summer intern in our RAU program, 2 summers ago. And then this is him presenting his work, and has stayed as a regular casual employee at the lab. So he comes every week and we do experiments, and it's great fun. And it's great because he's actually majoring in theoretical quantum physics and computer science. So he gets like his hands dirty literally with that project. So what are geysers? Geysers, let's see if that works. That was supposed to be a video. And the most basic definition is that geysers are, how do I hide the bar? Okay, there you go. Geysers are hydrothermal features that erupt periodically. There's many hydrothermal features in mostly tectonically active places where there's some source of heat and a source of water, and they mix together. But geysers are these unique features where there's a process of building pressure that leads to an eruption. There are geysers in several places around the world. Like I said, it needs to be tectonically active to have a source of heat. There's Valley of Geysers in Kamchatka, and the Geyser, which is the original namesake of geysers, that is located in Iceland. Of course, there's the many geysers of Yellowstone National Park, an area with many geysers and hydrothermal features in El Tatio, Chile. and Lake Bogoria in Kenya and in New Zealand. These are pictures from some of these places, and you can see some similarities and some differences. This is the big Valley of Geysers in Kamchatka, which I've never been, but looks like a fascinating place to visit. Geyser, Yellowstone, Earth2Class, and New Zealand. Somehow this picture from Kenya disappeared, but they look similar. So we study geyser a lot because it's super interesting, and actually a lot of people are interested in it, and they visit a place like here. This is spectators looking at Old Faithful in Yellowstone National Park, which gets from what I hear 4 million visitors a year. It sounds insane. But it's always crowded. There's always a crowd of people watching, and these people often read the sign next to it or go to the visitor center, and they want to understand, why is it doing this? What can we know about it? We only see the what's above the surface, what's going on underground. So this is one reason we want to study it. One of those visitors is my mom just a couple of years ago. I wanted to give her a shout out. Again, this is Geyser. Again, gets hundreds of thousands of visitors, which for a country with so few people, this is one of the biggest attractions. And you can see already that there's some difference in how these two geysers look. Here there's a little hill, and the steam and water erupt from the top of that hill. We call that a cone geyser. And in Geyser, there's a big pool of water that kind of inflates and then erupts through that. So we'll talk a little bit about how we can simulate that in a lab setting. Another reason to study geyser is that it is a much more accessible system than volcanoes to study, but they share a lot of features. There is, in principle, a conduit and a chamber that builds pressure through a process that can be crystallization and magma or cooling, or it can be in release of volatiles, or it can be the addition of steam from around in a geyser. But the physical processes of deformation, oscillation, pressure building, and eruption, that is similar. So we can use that as an analog without having to deal with over 1,000 degrees heat of magmas. Also, geysers are basically an end member for a hydrothermal system that helps us know what's going on the underground. So, but it can also be teach us something about hydrothermal system in general, how liquids and steam travel through permeable rock, what's the process of capping, how cracks form, things like that. So studying geysers, because they're so fascinating and kind of an end member, can help us study hydrothermal systems in general. So how do geysers work? The essential process is that there's geothermal energy and hydrothermal flow supply heat and water to an underground cavity system. Then that pressure lets the water superheat, so it goes over its boiling temperature, and then it expands, and there's more and more, and eventually it fills up, and there's spillage at the surface. And that spillage leads to a sudden loss of pressure that gets to a flash boiling of the water, build a lot of gas, a lot of bubbles forming, rapid building of pressure that leads to eruption. And then there's been a lot of studies of geysers, and since more than 100 years ago, there's been, more than 200, years ago, there's been this concept that geysers are not just a conduit and a chamber right underneath, but that there should be some offset, geometrical offset between that conduit and the subsurface reservoir. And that offset controls the eruption cycles and repeatability and oscillations and other processes. This side reservoir has been named the bubble trap, because over the water here, there will be an area that captures steam and gas, so that that would be a bubble, but it gets trapped, and then it can serve as sort of a spring because it compresses and releases, and control how the water erupts. And to really have a bigger explosion, that requires some of that steam and in the bubble trap to get to the conduit and release. There's so this this sketch is from Mackenzie from 1811, and that was of course a sketch. But now we have modern data to support that hypothesis and that concept of the bubble trap. Modern seismology, for example, work that was done at Old Faithful showed the location of micro earthquakes, tiny events that presumably bubbles going through the cracks, or cracks expanding and releasing. And they were able to separate them based on the characteristics of the events to conduit events that were all located in that area, and cavity events. And there was a lateral offset between the cavity and the conduit. So essentially a proof that this geometry is at least true in this geyser. Other geysers, these are pictures from El Tatio, have been interpreted to also have different types of geometries, mostly because of how the dynamics of the eruptions or relationships between neighboring geysers. So for example, in El Jefe, the idea is that it's probably has this kind of zigzaggy bubble trap geometry, similar to what we just saw for Old Faithful, and that leads to its episodic explosions in the at the surface. For Vega Rinconada, there is that too, but it's also connected to another pool. So there is some pressure regulation and an exchange of fluids, but the gas only comes through the one vent because it's the shorter path. There's no point for the gas to take that detour to the pool. But that pool regulates the pressure building in that one conduit. In El Cabrera, there is a primary geyser that erupts regularly. It doesn't have a bubble trap, at least by this interpretation. And there's next to it, there's a secondary geyser and a mud volcano, and there is not really any communication between them, even though they're very close to each other. They interpreted that all of these geysers are connected to a deep reservoir of hot water and steam, because they were still able to see some common frequencies and relationships between all of these subsystems. This is data collected at El Jefe, where they're able to put temperature and pressure sensors down the conduit, and not very far down, it's about 2 meters down, but it's still quite impressive. And they were able to see cycles. So they collected data over many eruptions, hundreds and thousands of eruptions, and looked at the duration and the timing between them. And these are some of these cycles shown at 4 of their sensors at different depths. So you'll see this is temperature, so it goes up and down significantly at the surface. It goes back to 40 degrees, but then goes up to 80 during the cycle. And then the variations are not as big, but you can still see them 60 centimeters down, 120 and 170 centimeters down the conduit. The pressures are more similar because it has to be communication between along that conduit, but you can see that they're highly close to the temperature. What was noticed in that data from El Jefe is that before an eruption, there are oscillations. We call it pre-play. So there's oscillations that you can detect even at relatively shallow depth, but definitely at deep, at higher depth. And that they were trying to say whether these oscillations can tell us when the next eruption is going to happen. And you can start to see that, in geysers, sometimes you can forecast, sometimes they're very, very on clock, like Old Faithful, named because how reliable it is. But some places, you can't always know when the next eruption is going to be. And wouldn't it be so cool if there was some tool next, a little countdown next to a geyser that is unreliable, that would show we are forecasting because the frequency of the oscillation of the pre-play is getting higher, maybe there'll be an explosion in an hour or 2 hours or something. But you can also see that connection with forecasting volcanic eruptions. What if this analog tells us something that we should look for in a volcano that might be a very, very subtle signal, but might tell us when a volcanic eruption is going to happen? And that ties directly into hazard assessment and hazard mitigation. So this is a picture of the team that went to El Tatio, and they put in the sensors inside, but for the most part, we can't always look inside. So Hans comes building a geyser in the lab. This is a schematic of a geyser that we built at the fluid mechanics lab. It's comprised of a large water tank that has a narrow conduit, and because of the geometry of the conduit extending down into the tank and into the water, we formed a geometry of bubble trap. So we trap steam on top of the water, and then that gets into the conduit when the pressure conditions are appropriate. We connected that tank to a steam boiler, the kind of industrial scale steam boilers that you get in if you build a sauna in your home. And then we also included boiling, like heating elements that stick from the bottom of the tank. And we instrumented the setup with pressure and temperature sensors along the conduit and the top and the bottom of the tank, and as well as video cameras looking at the conduit. We used to have ones at the tank, but now we moved them up to the top of the conduit because there's a lot more going on there. It's a picture of our setup, again, with Aksha and a high school student who spent the summer working with us last summer. And this is our old tank. It was made of plastic, so we can see what's inside. You can see the heating element and the conduit and the big tank. This is a drain line. This is where the steam comes in. Sadly, this tank couldn't survive after 2 years of major abuse with heating and boiling and pressure and all that. It cracked, so now we have a metal tank that would hopefully hold better, but that means that we cannot see inside. But we have enough information we collected with the plastic tank in the past. All these white wires are the pressure and temperature sensors. They all go into a recording data loggers and computers. These pressure sensors can get up to 10 kilohertz, which is what you would need to record the data if you wanted to look at kind of bubble formation, bubble nucleation and breakup and things like that. So far, we haven't looked at that high frequency because we collect for a pretty long time to look at those foreplay, the pre-play and eruption dynamics and oscillation. So it's pretty long experiments.
Excuse me, Einat. We had a question in the chat.
Oh, okay. Let me
Richard
see.
asks, can you regulate the restriction of the conduit?
You mean the diameter? Yes. So we had we were working with a 1-inch diameter and a 2-inch diameter. The 2-inch diameter conduits worked great, but they made a really big mess. So we stopped doing that. What we do have is inside the conduit, we have segments. Let's see. Yeah, so you see how the conduit is modular. It's not just one long piece. It is made of 2 feet segments. So we also have segments that have narrowing constrictions in them. And we put them along the conduit sometimes when we do experiments on that. And I have slides on that later. So this picture is from kind of the early days of the experiments. Then in 2023, we expanded, made it much taller so we can get to higher pressures. Built kind of the second story of the geyser setup, and now we have to climb really tall ladders to get to the top, but it's really fun. We have since also renovated, and all this flimsy shower curtains have been replaced with sturdy, lab-worthy, heavy-duty plastic curtains to make it safer. We don't get splashed as much anymore, and it overall looks a lot nicer. And I wish we were in person, and I would take you all to see the lab, but at this point, this would do. But of course, you're all very much welcome to come and visit and see the setup with your students or by yourself. So I want to tell you results from 2 types of experiments that we've been doing. One is looking at oscillations in the conduit. Remember how I told you that natural geysers seem to oscillate at different frequencies. And we're trying to use it as a tool to infer what the underground looks like. So we were trying to relate the frequency of the oscillations in the conduit and on all the pressure and temperature sensors with how big the tank is and what the size of that bubble trap is. Then we also look at experiments where we reach eruption and look at the eruption dynamics and the cyclicity of eruptions and how that relates to things like constrictions in the conduit, this amount of space in the bubble trap, and the supply of heat, water, and steam. So these are pressure measurements that were done in Old Faithful, and you can see that there is actually an increase in the frequency of oscillations as we get closer to an eruption that happened somewhere here. So this high energy band in a spectrogram, this shows the spectrum of the oscillations recorded over time. There's sort of a 1 hertz, a little less than 1, a little over 1 trajectory of along that kind of build up time period. There's also, so these are zoom in on, maybe 10 seconds, but you can see those 1 hertz oscillations, even though the overall sequence looks just like it just goes up. So it goes up and down, but it goes periodically. So the experimental procedure is that we fill the tank with water, then we increase the pressure by adding either heat, air, or steam, and record how full the conduit is and how full the tank is. And then we add a perturbation. We add a small volume of steam, release, and we record the oscillations that are triggered. This is a video of the conduit, and you can see how that water goes up and down, and we record it on the videos, but more easily on the pressure and temperature sensors. And you can see how it also decays with time, the amplitude, because of attenuation in the water. So here's a pressure record showing that oscillations. It usually is very nice and clean signal, because everything else is quieted down. And we connected this, so we made many experiments looking at different heights and in the bubble trap and in the conduit and different geometries. And then the team at Davis developed a mathematical model for relating the oscillation frequency with the properties of the system that they did through kind of an energetics balance calculation. So there's total energy in the system that is a sum of the thermal, kinetic, and potential energy. And there's a conservation of energy, a principle, right? So the derivative of energy with time is to be zero. When you do that, that gives you an equation of motion, which we'll go through the terms now. This is the total fluid length and acceleration, which we'll use to calculate the frequencies. Then this term is the kinetic energy. You can see X is the level of the water level in the tank. So its derivative is the speed. And then this is the gravitational potential energy, because if it goes up, it has more potential energy. So it's a linear function of X. And then this is the thermodynamic compression work that has to do with the change in the volume in the bubble trap. So if we assume that the level of water in the tank, X behaves as a solution of this form of an oscillation, because we see that, then we can derive that type of a solution that says the relationship between the frequency of the oscillations and the gravitational, compressional, and kinetic energy terms. And as a function, you'll see of X and Y, these are the water fill levels. And SB and SC is the ratio between the bubble trap surface area and the conduit surface area. So it already gives us a way to connect the frequencies that we observe with subsurface geometry and fill levels. We're quite happy to see that there was a one-to-one agreement between the predicted frequency from the model with the observed frequency from the experiments. So sometimes things do work. This was for cold water experiments, so so we didn't have to worry about cooling. But then, of course, we wanted to look at hot water. So the model was modified a little bit to also include that thermodynamics of the steam compressing. And this is for the 2-inch cold water, and that this is for hot water. And there was, again, an agreement between our predictions and our observed frequencies. The colors here are the sensitivity to the difference in field level between the tank and the conduit. So Y bar and X bar are those field levels between conduit and the tank. We only sensitive to that difference. So if they're both 5 centimeters higher, 5 centimeters lower, we're not going to be able to resolve that. But at least, we can see some of that relationship gets expressed in the frequency. Again, that's for hot water for 1 inch. So model works, which is great. Then we said, okay, so now we need to apply it to a natural system. And we made the calculation of what a conduit field level and would be depth to water. So that, like, what's the cap, that bubble trap height and underground would be, and what the frequency is expected to be. So we span that space, and we see that the model is actually not so sensitive to the conduit fill level. It is very sensitive to the size of the bubble trap. And the observed frequency, remember that 1 hertz, 0.7 hertz we saw in the data, tells us that most likely there's only maybe a centimeter of bubble trap above the water in Old Faithful, which is tiny. And we're still not quite sure this is real, but this is what we have for now. And that would mean, if we remember that seismicity diagram from Old Faithful, that would mean that this tiny little layer needs to be really tiny. But the one, we're not unsure that this is right yet. One problem that we have right now that we're looking at is that the frequency of oscillations before eruptions at Old Faithful increases. Remember, from like 0.7 to 1 hertz. But in our experiments, the frequency as the conduit fills up gets lower. So there's something that we're not capturing, and we're working on it right now. But this pushed us to doing experiments where there's a very, very small gap of bubble trap. And that's what we've been doing in the last few weeks. Next, I want to talk about eruption dynamics experiments, so that we don't just like let everything quiet down and then just do a little perturbation, but we let everything go to the top and flash boil and explode. We did experiments with hot water where we keep supplying heat and that erupt either into kind of a cone, so into the air, or into a pool. And then we did experiments where we have hot water that we supply steam from that steam boiler and just keep it open, supply steam continuously, and see whether those are different. And then we also did experiments where we don't just get one eruption, but we get cycles. So we keep supplying heat and water to allow for the cycles to continue for multiple cycles. Here is a video of how these eruptions look. So if you just look at the conduit, you see the water level is going to go up, and it's oscillating a little bit, but it keeps going up. This is because we kept the boilers on. It boils, boils, boils. And then it erupts. And these eruptions usually last about a minute to 2 minutes. You can play that again. Here we get to the spillage, and then there's a sudden release of steam bubbles from the water, and that creates a big amount of pressure and eruption. At the conduit, this is showing side by side how things look at the top and at the conduit. You'll see a little more, couple of seconds delay between the videos, but you can see this very, very rapid release of bubbles through the conduit to the tip. So that's what the data looks like. These are pressure in blue and temperature in red records at the different sensors. Sensor 1 is at the bottom of the tank, and sensor 2 is at the top of the tank. And you can see that they track each other very, very closely. And the pressure, the temperature is a little bit more varied. That's because it takes some time for the temperature to circulate into the bottom where some of the more colder water accumulate. But at the top, because it's the gas the temperature and pressure are completely directly correlated. Sensor 3 is at the bottom of the conduit, so you can see how the pressure builds up, but then the temperature depends on when the water gets there. But then this gets to eruption, so this is the time of eruption, and you can see a lot of these kind of oscillations that happen at the conduit. Sensor 4 is at the top of the conduit, so this is kind of building up to that. I'm sorry, it's in the middle of the conduit. And then sensor 6 is at the very top. So it only sees action when the water finally gets there. And then that just a little bit before eruption actually happens. With the video data, we're able to do things like take a cross section in the middle, and then do an image processing to see what the amount of vapor versus water that we get over time. So each of these little lines is kind of a dark spot in the image. So that is a bubble. So we see initially there's like one bubble and it goes up. And then there's another one goes up and up and up. And then we get to a period of much faster bubbles. They can still tell them individually until eventually you can't. So this period here is sort of that kind of build up just before an eruption happens. There's data from eruptions that are driven by steam. So rather than just supplying heat, we're supplying both heat and mass. And you see these have this kind of funny tendency that when we just start injecting the steam, there's like a little explosions, which is kind of an artifact of our geometry. Any addition of steam initially just goes directly into the conduit and just releases whatever is stuck in there. And then the rest of the steam goes into the tank and build that kind of gradual pressure build up towards an eruption. So you see in these sensors, the kind of build up of pressure and then steady, and then this is where the actual eruption happens. So we see that the dynamics are actually quite different depending on what is supplying the energy to the system. And we have only done these recently, so we're still trying to wrap our minds around why it's so different. Why, for example, there's this really long, steady period with you saw that with the heat-driven eruptions, there's spill up, and then really seconds later, there was already an eruption. And here, with the steam eruptions, we see that there's spill and spill and spill and spill and spill. It's like, okay, come on, come on, come on. And then, more than 200 seconds, they just sit there and wait and add steam and add steam and add steam until there's finally an eruption. And the eruptions are not as violent. So we're thinking about why this is happening. We don't have an answer yet. I think this is another example, but spills and spills and spills, and then eventually there's an eruption, like another eruption. There was a question earlier, and I wanted to show that we've actively worked on that. What is the role of constrictions? So this is a cross-section at the conduit of Old Faithful, and it was studied by submerging a video camera into the conduit, and they were able to kind of measure what the apparent width or diameter around that camera was. And then here they got through some sort of a constriction. This is where they actually found water when they put the camera down. That's the maximum water level. And then it went through that constriction and saw a wider area and then a narrower area and a much wider. This is dashed because they didn't really see the edge. And then another narrow area. But then here it's ductus incognito because they couldn't get the camera all the way down. This is the maximum depth that they reached. But we expect that most conduits are like that and not just kind of a straight, smooth plastic cylinder. So we added segments to our conduits that kind of have this cross-section geometry. So it's half the width of the conduit. And we wanted to see how that impacts the eruptions. We did kind of a compare and contrast type of experiments where we have setups that have no constrictions, setups that have one constriction at the bottom, one at the top, or two, bottom and top together. And then also that 2-inch, these are all the 1-inch conduit, and this is a 2-inch conduit. We started them all at the same tank water level and conduit water level. And then we did them, if we could, do twice. So we do one eruption, let it release some water, and then if there is enough, do another eruption. So that would be that secondary starting level. This is a pressure recording from an experiment with a constriction at the top. So there was an eruption, and then there was oscillations. And then you see that the frequency of the oscillations get actually longer as the time goes by away from the eruption end. We also tracked the timing of the start and end of each eruption and each geometry. And when we did that for all the different configurations, we saw that there was some relationship between the number of constrictions and the duration of the eruption. So when there's no constrictions, they were short, 50 to 100 seconds long between the start and end. Then for one constriction, they were longer overall, and then for two constrictions, they were the longest. The labels say where that constriction was, and it didn't seem to matter very much. We also relate that whether it's a primary or a secondary eruption, and they don't seem to be any systematics on that. And whether it's the constriction is at the top, the middle, or the middle at 50 centimeters, the middle at 100, didn't really seem to matter much. But overall, we would expect when there's more constrictions to help the eruption to last longer. What we didn't expect was to find shock waves. So these are dynamic processes when the fluid velocity gets above the speed of sound, and it creates a shock wave through the system back again from the constriction. So this is an experiment that had two constrictions at the top and the middle, and this is data from sensors at the top, middle, and bottom. And you can see that there's this spikes in the pressure data, and we know that they're not just kind of a faulty sensor reading because we see them in all the sensors. This is the bottom, this is the top. And then we are able in a few of our experiments to track that shock wave as it traveled down from the constriction that caused it through the system down below. It's a little tricky to see in some of them and the kind of the frequency of this data set, but we're able to see it in others. So that's something that maybe with high enough frequency recording in natural system, we would be able to find. So it's like a to-do list for people who go out to the field, maybe record at a high enough pressure frequency to see any shock waves, because that can tell us maybe where the constrictions are without putting a video camera down. It can tell us what the speed of the fluid is through the system. Now, wanted to look at cycles of eruptions. Like we saw in the data, and we all know from visiting places like Geysers or Earth2Class, the eruptions are not a one-off. They often repeat. So there's pictures from Vega Rinconada geyser in Chile, in El Tatio, where this is a picture, so you can see of the water level go up and then erupt, then go up. These are smaller eruptions and bigger eruptions, small and big. This is temperature records and pressure records, and three different setups, but you can see the cycles. So what we did is first we ran a sequence of cold water cycles. The idea was very, very simple. We connected both the hose, the water hose, and the pressure air hose to the top of the tank, and just let it fill up and release, and fill up and release, and just nothing was related to boiling. It was just a space consideration. So we compared what happens when we change the amount of water and air that come in through the valve. So this is an eruption and a cycle with full water input and full air input, and we're able to see kind of the oscillations toward the main eruption, but then many more cycles over that, and they were about 5 seconds apart from each other. And you can see the kind of most filtered out data from the bottom of the tank, and we can see all these bumps. Each of these bumps is an eruption at the top. We changed the air to just half the flux, and the cycles got longer. There's more air, less air coming in. That makes sense, but also this cleared up the signal a lot, and we can see that kind of build up and oscillations and build up and oscillations much more smoothly and nicely, and it's a lot more repeatable. So that's also something to think about, once you look at a natural system, what the type of signal can tell us about the flux into the system. This is a repeat of that same configuration, so it's very reliable. It's not a fluke. This is cutting down the water to half the flux, and again, the duration between eruptions extended because there's less flux coming in, but the overall shape of the signal hasn't changed significantly. Same conditions, pretty repeatable. And then we went to hot water. So here is we have the hot water on, but instead of pressing everything with the air, we're pressing everything by keeping all the boilers on. And again, we saw very, very reliable cycles. These are the pressure in blue, temperature in red, from the top, bottom of the conduit, and the top and bottom of the tank. You can see really beautiful buildup and then very sudden eruptions. And so the type, kind of the overall shape of the wave looks different than what it was with just water. So it makes sense because the process is completely different that's driving the eruptions. This is flash boil. And so we see a lot more signal on the temperature, and the waveform itself is much cleaner. This is eruption cycles where we're driving everything by steam, and we see that it's a much noisier process. There's less clear cyclicity, but they're actually pretty quick to each other. So here, the cycles were quite long. They were about 18 minutes apart. While here, we're able to see kind of repeated cycles every 2 or 3 seconds. So it's a different process that releases some of that pressure. But it's cyclic regardless. These are new experiments that we have with the steam on, and remember that kind of road cleaning initial pulse that we see in the pressure and temperature. But then with the new setup with the metal tank, we have somehow not been able to reach cycles. We're still building to it, but what we see is there's kind of much longer period of steady and then a release and another release. So we'll have to think about why this is all happening, but it's exciting because it's a puzzle. This is a video that I'm not able to turn around because it's on YouTube, but let me try and run to it. And it's from one of the latest eruption that we have. Let's see. So you see the water kind of rising up and the conduit. It's higher and higher. And then there's kind of spills. Like I said, it's kind of with these types of supply with just steam, we have to wait quite a bit of time before any eruption happens. So there's kind of buildup. Now we see a lot of steam escaping. This. Okay.
Where is that?
So it does reach eruption. It's not as violent as the ones that we had before, and it lasts longer. So we're trying to figure out what has changed and the way the pressure is building up. But it's if anything, it's going to teach us something. This difference is going to teach us something about how the system configuration impacts eruptions. The last kind of type and topic that we've addressed that I want to show you is looking at the difference between cone and pool geyser eruptions. So we mentioned that some geysers, what we call the cone geyser, where there's kind of a sediment buildup around where that vent opens. And that means that the conduit communicates directly with the atmosphere, and that's the pressure that the conduit and the reservoir are feeling. While some other geysers, the top of the conduit opens into the pool, so there's a constant pressure barrier that between the atmosphere and the conduit and the reservoir that is just always there. And the eruptions happen through that. So the dynamics are expected to be quite different, and we're trying to think how we can simulate that in the lab. This is a pool geyser eruption video from Stroker geyser. So you can see how it just builds up. So this is the pool. This is it's gonna be a little bit of a slow motion. Yeah. It just builds up and then opens. Okay, so we recently added a pool to our configuration. This is the pool up here, and it connects to the end of the conduit. And this is a close-up of Aksha installing the pool and a little bit of water. We're able to drain the pool. There's also a sensor that records the pressure in the pool, which is basically going to be what the depth of the water is, as well as any waves through it, and the temperature. This is a record from an eruption cycle that we had, kind of the very first thing that we did. We just kept the heaters on and the water on, but didn't add any water. And we're able to get 4 cycles of eruptions because the water erupted into the pool and then drained back in. So remember before, to get cycles, we had to keep adding water because it was losing water to the environment. But here we were able to get 4 cycles by simply letting it recycle its own water from the pool, and heating them up with the heaters. So this is the pressure. You can see that they're very repeatable, and it had this interesting bump, and it happened in all the different in all 4 cycles that we're not even really sure what that is related to, but it was that kind of once most of the water comes back in, there's maybe some sort of a rearrangement of the steam and the cool from the water that came through the conduit and then gets resorted. We're not really sure why that bump is there, but it's in all the different sensors. This is the bottom of the tank, top of the tank, bottom of the conduit, top of the conduit. So this is really tells us when eruption is happening. So there's sort of a main eruption phase, and then that bump is related to some kind of secondary phase, secondary eruption. But we're still trying to see what's happening. But it's very promising that we're able to look at eruptions with a pool and with a cone. So a cone would be just having that conduit open to the air, and be able to compare and contrast the processes in these 2 configurations. So in conclusions, we built a geyser analog with a bubble trap. It's bigger and has an actual bubble trap that is compared to any other analog geysers that has been in the past. Our experiments confirm theoretical models for both hot and cold water oscillations. So our assumptions going into the models are justified. The relative size of the bubble trap to the conduit is inversely related to the oscillations. So it's already an observable that can be collected in natural systems, from surface level observations to subsurface geometry. And as the fluid levels increase, the oscillations slow down. So again, an observable that can maybe be used to forecast eruptions in natural geysers. Also, our experiments demonstrate the impact of geometry on eruption dynamics, frequency, and magnitude. That observing the frequency and magnitude of eruption cycles and intercycle fluctuations can reveal details about the underground geometry and the flux. Remember, we have heat, high capacity, low capacity coming in that can tell that surface observations can reveal details of that. Wanted, because this is an Earth2Class lecture, to also include some ideas for teaching and activities if any of you wanted to maybe take that topic into classrooms. And I was able to find a few ideas online and looking around. So one is there's a data analysis activity for old faithful data that was able to find at the CERC website, CERC.carleton.edu, that I'm sure you're all familiar with. then if you really wanted to, you could build a large geyser following an activity in an actual scientific paper that was published in France by a school teacher and a student that built one at school. You can also build a much smaller analog in the school lab. Or better than everything, of course, is to come visit the fluids lab at Lamont. So this is the screenshot from the activity that I found at the CERC on the CERC website, where they have data, and you can look at histograms of eruptions and talk about statistics, talk about so they cover the core neuroscience subject would be, of course, hydrothermal features, but the quantitative literacy topics that activity uses are probability and frequency and working with real data. So on the CERC website, they provide the data sets, but they also guide you towards resources. For example, the Geyser Observation and Study Association, or GOSA, which collects a ton of data about a lot of geysers. So students would go out to the website and collect data for themselves that will be up to date. And another example for maybe ambitious activity is this paper, A Geyser in the Garden, where a school group in France built a geyser using a pressure cooker and a very, very long copper tube conduit and a basin fill that helped them regulate the temperature and the pressure. This seems sort of a dangerous endeavor, but they have in that paper like all the details and schematics and everything you would need. They have like a pressure regulator and all that. So there is a way to do it safely, and they even collected really interesting data from their setup. So if somebody wanted to do it, there's a kind of a blueprint of how to do it from this paper. Another maybe smaller scale setup to do is simulate a setup like that from a paper from the Berkeley group, where they used a curved conduit, glass conduit connected to a chamber. So this curve allowed them to have a bubble trap geometry of sort, so that because bubbles will accumulate in this corner here, but they were able to. This was a hot plate and regulated with a water bath that drove eruptions into that void. So it's much smaller, maybe safer, but something that one could go and maybe try and build as a project for a school lab. And lastly is, of course, come visit us at the Fluid Lab and see. It takes us about 2 hours to heat up the tank. So if you give us enough notice, we can heat up the tank and show you some cool explosions. And we'll be happy to help you. So this is all I had. And I'll be happy to take questions.
That water that comes out of Old Faithful, would that be superheated steam?
Yeah, it has to be superheated.
Superheated, so don't go running through.
While it's at pressure, of course, as soon as it erupts, it's
so it's it's extra hot steam that would be very big. What heats the water though? Is it trickling down onto hot rocks, or is it actually coming in contact with magma? What really?
Yeah, so the magma is deeper. It's
Deeper.
much at Yellowstone. It's at the kind of few kilometers depth. The water is not touching the magma. That would, if the water touched the magma, that would be a big explosion. Then we don't want that.
Right. Okay.
What we call a phreatomagmatic eruption. We don't want that. But yeah, the rock is hot. So it just trickles through. Sorry about that. It trickles through hot rock and heats up.
Okay. Yeah. How deep?
Much to heat water, just 100 degrees.
All right. How deep are the rocks then that it's coming in contact with?
How deep are the reservoirs
Yeah.
in Old Faithful? We don't know.
Let me know.
In those seismic events, actually we do know in that seismic um event slide they had the um they had the depth at right in the study they had the depth at 15 to 20 meters.
I see. Yeah.
The water comes through everything around it, so it can come down, come up from like steam would rise, and trickle through. So it could come from I don't know, even 100 meters,
I see.
kilometers.
These other geysers, they're all scheduled like Old Faithful has a certain period of time. I forgot. What is it? About 12, 40 minutes. I don't remember. I forgot.
Right.
But the others also have a schedule. The other geysers, similar to Old Faithful.
Not all of them.
No. No.
Yeah, some are very reliable and have a period, some don't.
Okay.
There's even in Yellowstone National Park, there's some geysers that haven't erupted in years and then erupt again next week. And
I
there's
got it. Right.
not necessarily a periodicity per se for each of them. That's why we're trying to find if there's any way to forecast based on, for example, the vibration oscillation frequency.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure thing.
Annette, what kind of qualifications are you looking for in the students that you take?
Like the high school students mostly just need to be okay with like working with their hands a little bit. There's always like anything from installing the cameras up above or screwing things up again, and to after a big eruption we have to clean up the floor. So not shy away from actually doing the work. Mostly being able to, like being okay with things not working out half the time and not getting upset by that. But then also our data analysis we use Python scripts that Akshat wrote and Utkarsh wrote. So we want them to not necessarily know coding coming in, but be okay with like not be scared of it. So they'll be willing to learn and use the codes and make big use from them, and mostly it's like be open-minded. I think is the key in this project.
And how do they apply for admission?
So the high schoolers that we've had in the past were through the SSFRP internship that Bob Newton used to run. Now is Ben Bostic. And I think the application for this summer has closed already, but
Right.
they around January. So they just submit an application. I've had students in the lab, not on this project, but on other projects that came through some specific agreements with schools. I had students from Lycée Français that there was an agreement between Lamont and Lycée Français for a few summers, and they sent a few students to my lab and the Billy DeAndre's lab and Christine McCarthy's lab. I don't know if that's still on, but some schools can reach some sort of agreements like that that is not through SSFRP. Yeah, so there's different ways.
Okay, thank you.
Good time.
Very nice, Annette. Thank you
Sure
very
thing.
much.
Yeah, thanks for listening. Really great seeing you on this morning. And yeah, by all means, we love showing off setup. So if any of you are nearby, drop me an email and we can coordinate a visit.
Okay, we have one more Earth2Class during this academic year. That will be on May 11th, and it'll be Dallas Abbott.